Welcome to Mystery Cafe, your ultimate stop for gripping detective stories, chilling mysteries, and unforgettable investigations. Here, every video serves a fresh dose of suspense, shocking twists, and cases that challenge your inner detective. From classic whodunits to modern crime stories, we bring the world of mystery straight to your screen, where every clue matters and no secret stays buried for long. Before we start unraveling today's mystery, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa. Drop your country, city, or stay in the comments, and let's see how far the Mystery Cafe family reaches. Magnifying glass tilted right.
Chapter 1, The Invitation to Whitby Grange. The wind swept sharply across the Yorkshire moors, its mournful song curling around the grand chimneys of Whitby Grange. Allan Pinkerton, wrapped in a dark travelling coat, stepped down from the carriage, his eyes taking in the sprawling estate with a practiced gaze. It was the sort of house that could, in the right circumstances, become a fortress, or a prison. The butler, tall and frostily polite, took his coat. "Mr. Pinkerton, sir. Mr. Carstone is expecting you in the drawing-room." Pinkerton nodded. "And the other guests?" His voice was calm, deliberate. "They have gathered already, sir. Dinner will be served shortly." The drawing-room was warm with firelight, but it was the kind of warmth that seemed more for show than comfort. Henry Carstone, a stout man with a florid face and restless hands, came forward. "My dear Mr. Pinkerton, I cannot tell you what a relief it is to see you. I only wish the circumstances were more agreeable." "I understand you've been receiving threats," Pinkerton replied, his Scottish accent softened by years abroad. "And you believe someone in this house might be responsible?" Carstone glanced over his shoulder at the assembled company before lowering his voice. "That is my fear. The letters, anonymous, of course, speak of ruin, exposure, and a reckoning for past sins. They arrived over the past fortnight, and the tone grows bolder." Pinkerton's gaze swept the room as Carstone introduced him to the guests. There was Eleanor Carstone, the hostess, pale and refined, her smile polite but brittle. Near her, Charles Ashworth, a sharply dressed barrister, leaned too comfortably against the mantelpiece, his eyes flicking over Pinkerton with quiet assessment. Lady Margaret Bexley, draped in green silk, radiated the faintly amused air of one accustomed to observing drama without being touched by it. Beside her, a tall, dark-haired man, introduced as Dr. Lionel Marbury, stood apart, fingers clasped tightly as if holding in some private anxiety. In the corner, Miss Ada Whitcomb, a young woman with quick eyes, sat with a notebook, sketching the fire screen with deliberate strokes. Pinkerton noticed she did not look up during the introductions. Dinner was served in a long, candlelit hall where shadows leaned and shifted across the oak-paneled walls. Conversation was lively, but under it ran a faint current of tension. Carstone steered the talk to neutral topics, business, the weather, the scarcity of imported tea, but Pinkerton caught the slight silences when certain names or places were mentioned. At one point, Charles Ashworth remarked, "I trust, Mr. Pinkerton, that in America your work is, rather more straightforward than it must be in our tangled little island." Pinkerton smiled faintly. "Human nature, Mr. Ashworth, is remarkably consistent, whether in Chicago or Yorkshire. The motives for malice are universal." Lady Margaret chuckled, a sound like the rustle of silk. "How ominous. One begins to wonder if our dinner party is to become a scene from one of those ghastly sensation novels." "Perhaps," Pinkerton said, his tone mild, "but in my experience, reality tends to be far more cunning." As the courses progressed, he observed small details, Dr. Marbury's hand trembling as he poured wine, Ada Whitcomb's pencil darting in quick, furtive movements, Eleanor Carstone's eyes flicking repeatedly towards her husband as though willing him to be careful in what he said. When dessert was cleared, Carstone suggested coffee in the library. The room was magnificent, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes, the fire banked low, throwing a soft glow on polished wood and brass. Pinkerton admired the precision of the order here, rows unbroken, titles neatly aligned, until he noticed one volume slightly askew, its spine faintly smudged. Such a detail might mean nothing. Or it might mean everything. As the guests settled, Pinkerton drew Carstone aside. "Tell me, did the letters specify what past sins they refer to?" Carstone hesitated. "No. But, there was an incident, some years ago, in which certain members of our company tonight were involved. It was all hushed up. And you believe the writer is one of them?" "I cannot think who else it might be." Before Pinkerton could press further, Eleanor Carstone approached, her voice cool but edged. "Henry, dear, you promised not to discuss unpleasant matters during the visit." Carstone flushed, muttering something about not troubling the ladies. Pinkerton merely inclined his head, filing away the small tremor in Eleanor's hand as she withdrew. Later, when the guests drifted away to their rooms, Pinkerton lingered in the library. He examined the Askew book. It was a volume of legal case histories. Inside, between pages 143 and 144, he found a scrap of paper with hastily scrawled words, "You cannot hide the truth forever." No signature, no date. Replacing the book exactly as he had found it, Pinkerton returned to the hall, his mind already turning over the possibilities. Someone in Whitby Grange was not merely threatening Henry Carstone, they were toying with him, setting the stage for something far more serious. And if his instincts were right, it would not be long before the first move was made. Chapter 2, A Sudden Death. The house was quiet in the small hours, save for the faint creak of timbers and the restless whisper of wind along the eaves. Allan Pinkerton, lying awake in the guest chamber allotted to him, found his mind returning to the unease of the evening. The guests had parted with polite words, but he had caught the guarded glances, the suppressed irritations. There was a tangle here, and he was still feeling for its ends. A sudden, muffled thud interrupted his thoughts. It came from below, perhaps the library. He rose at once, shrugging on his dressing gown and slipping into the corridor. The gas lamps were turned low, casting the hall in a honeyed gloom. A door opened a little way down, Lady Margaret emerged, her hair loose about her shoulders, a candle in hand. "Mr. Pinkerton. Did you hear?" "Yes," he said quietly. "From the library, I think." "Best you return to your room, Lady Margaret." But she followed as he descended the stairs, her slippers whispering against the carpet. At the library door, Pinkerton tried the handle. Locked. He knocked, calling, "Mr. Carstone." No answer. His eyes went to the small writing table in the corner of the hall where the servants kept spare keys. The hook-labeled library was empty. "Stand back," he told Lady Margaret. Taking a narrow blade from his pocket, he worked the lock with swift precision. The door swung inward, releasing a chill draft that smelt faintly of extinguished candle wax. Henry Carstone lay slumped in the armchair by the fire, his head lolling to one side. On the low table beside him stood a glass, a third full of some dark liquid. One of his hands rested limply on his knee, the other dangled over the arm of the chair, fingers grazing the carpet. Lady Margaret gasped. "Is he?" Pinkerton stepped forward, his voice low. "Yes. He is dead." The fire had burned low to embers, casting a dull glow over the scene. There was no sign of a struggle. On the writing desk lay a single sheet of paper with 3 words scrawled in a shaky hand: "Forgive me. Goodbye." An apparent suicide note. But Pinkerton's eyes narrowed. The glass on the table, its rim was clean, but the liquid inside carried a sharp, acrid odor. He touched the edge of Carstone's coat sleeve. Damp. Yet there was no spilled drink in sight. "Lady Margaret, I must ask you to rouse the household," Pinkerton said. "No one is to leave their rooms until I say so." Within 10 minutes, the library was filled with pale, dressing-gowned figures. Eleanor Carstone entered last, her face drained of color, her eyes fixed on her husband's body as if trying to reconcile the sight with memory. Dr. Marbury knelt to examine the body, murmuring, "Heart failure, perhaps, or poison. It is too soon to say." Too soon, Pinkerton agreed, and yet certain details already speak. He glanced at the locked door, then at the empty key hook. Who last had the key to this room? The butler, Mr. Hastings, stiffened. "It is always kept in the hall, sir. I saw it there before retiring." Charles Ashworth, arms folded, spoke up. "And you imply, Mr. Pinkerton, that one of us took it?" "I imply only that Mr. Carstone could not have locked the door from within if the key was missing from the inside." Pinkerton moved to the writing desk, holding up the note. "And this, while convenient, may not be what it seems." Ada Whitcomb, still clutching her sketchbook, asked in a low voice, "Do you mean, he was murdered?" "I mean," Pinkerton said, "that an investigation is required before such a conclusion, or its opposite, can be reached." He began his examination in silence, eyes roving over the room. The carpet near Carstone's chair bore a faint indentation, as if something heavy had rested there. A book from the shelf nearest the fire had fallen to the floor, its cover singed at the edge. A small thing, perhaps an accident, but Pinkerton noted it. The glass was removed to the butler's care for safekeeping. Pinkerton slipped the note into an envelope. As the guests were escorted back to their rooms, he lingered by the library door, touching the edge of the lock. Smooth, except for a tiny flake of metal lodged within. Filing marks. That, too, went into his mental ledger. When at last the house quieted again, Pinkerton stood before the dying fire, his arms folded. He did not believe in coincidences. A missing key. A note too conveniently worded. A locked room that might not have been so securely sealed after all. Someone here had killed Henry Carstone. The question was, who had the cunning to make it seem as though he had killed himself? Chapter 3, The Household Secrets. Allan Pinkerton and the Murder at Whitby Grange. Dawn found Whitby Grange a house of whispers. Servants moved as softly as if sound itself were disrespectful, guests spoke in the subdued tones people adopt in churches and sick rooms. Allan Pinkerton asked for the morning room to be set aside for interviews and, with the brisk efficiency of habit, sent Mr. Hastings, the butler, to inform everyone that they would be seen in turn. No one was to leave the grounds. No letters were to be posted, no fires to be lit save in the kitchen and the hall. He would have the scene of death left untouched by well-meaning tidiness. Before he saw a soul, Pinkerton went once more to the library. In daylight the room looked less sinister and more exacting, its order laid bare under the pale window light. He knelt by the door and inspected the escutcheon with a watchmaker's concentration. The tiny flake of metal he had noticed in the night had fallen lower and was now caught in the gap between plate and wood. He coaxed it out with the tip of a penknife. Steel, fine-toothed, as from a file. Someone had worked a key recently. The hearth, too, gave up a trifle, among the grey ash lay a hardened tier of green sealing wax, flattened as if trodden. The fire had been low, it would not have melted wax unless applied almost to the coals. He trapped it in an envelope, then ran a thoughtful finger along the mantle. A faint smear of soot halted just before the right-hand corner, as though a hand, resting there, had drawn back quickly. On the small table by Carstone's chair the ring mark of a glass was plainly visible now. Yet the glass Pinkerton had handed to Hastings in the night had been clean at the rim and the sleeve of the dead man's coat had been damp. He looked at the carpet and saw, a few inches from the table's leg, a shallow, circular indentation, the ghost of a bottle perhaps, together with a glint so slight it might have been a trick of light. He pinched it up, a crescent of mother-of-pearl no larger than a fingernail, polished on one face and jagged on the other. Part of a cufflink, most likely, the enamel chipped away to show nacre beneath. He slipped the fragment into his pocketbook and straightened. The room had given him enough for now. In the morning room, with its cold view of the east lawn, the procession began. Mr. Hastings came first, spare and upright. "I locked the principal doors at 10:30, sir. The library was unoccupied. The key, I am sure, was in its place on the hook. I retired at 11. Mrs. Christie, the housekeeper, customarily takes a last turn of the lower passage at 10:30. She has, her own opinion about candles left burning. You heard nothing in the night?" "No, sir. I sleep heavily." He colored slightly at that admission. "Mrs. Christie's room is next to the still room, she might have heard more." "You knew, Mr. Hastings, that Mr. Carstone had lately received threatening letters?" The butler's mouth tightened. "I knew there were letters. I did not read them." "Who handled the post?" "Myself, sir. And Peters, the first footman. Yesterday evening a note was pushed under the side door, no stamp, no seal. Peters gave it to Mr. Carstone on a salver before dinner." "And what became of it?" "I could not say, sir." "Thank you. Send me Mrs. Christie." Mrs. Christie came in at once, a square woman with a practical face and an expression that suggested Providence would not, in her presence, get away with much. "I heard steps on the back stairs at 12:20, she said without preface. "Light ones. I thought it was one of the young maids gone for water. I looked out and saw a candle turning the corner toward the front hall. The draught took it and the shadow ran along the wall. I could not swear to the person, but I took the color of the wrapper as green." "Green?" "Yes, sir. Silk, I suppose. I went down to tell them they'd have the house afire with their nonsense, but the hall was empty when I reached it. The library door was shut." "Did you notice the key?" "I did not, sir." "I'm sorry. You did your rounds at 10:30, you say. Was there anything unusual in the library then?" "Only that Mr. Carstone's writing desk was left unlocked. He was not one for carelessness in that way. I locked it myself and took the key to the tray by the pantry door, meaning to mention it to Mr. Hastings in the morning. The key was on the tray when I retired." "Thank you, Mrs. Christie." Eleanor Carstone entered after the housekeeper, the morning light showing the bluish shadows beneath her eyes. She carried, even now, that careful poise which vigorous self-command affords. "Mr. Pinkerton," she said, her voice level, "I imagine you have many questions. Please understand that, while I detest the indignity of it all, I am not so foolish as to hinder you. Your candor will serve us both, Mrs. Carstone. Did your husband confide the threats to you?" "At first, no. I learned of them 3 days ago when I intercepted the Morning Post. The language was theatrical, but sufficiently pointed to cause me concern. I begged Henry to cancel this week's house party. He would not. He always believed, that business and appearance could stare down danger. Did he receive a note last evening, delivered by hand? She frowned, recollection moving behind her eyes. Yes. A single folded sheet. I do not know what it said. He placed it in his pocket. He appeared composed at dinner, though his humor was forced. Forgive me, what was your own movement after retiring? She gave the ghost of a smile. You have adopted our English euphemisms rather charmingly, Mr. Pinkerton. I read for a time. I did not sleep until well after midnight. I left my room only when the alarm was raised. I am sorry to trouble you further. Would you allow me, later, to look through your husband's writing desk? She hesitated, then nodded. If we must. Charles Ashworth followed, brisk and urbane even in morning black. He sat without being asked and clasped one knee. The cuffs of his shirt were immaculate, fastened by dark, square links that drank the light. You were close to Mr. Carstone, Mr. Ashworth. Professionally, he said. I advised him in several delicate matters. He was not a man who enjoyed being advised. You retired at what hour? 11:15. I read until midnight, smoked a cigarette by the window, and saw nothing more exciting than my own reflection. This is all a ghastly outrage, of course, but if you are proposing to search rooms, kindly begin with mine. You will find it satisfyingly dull. Pinkerton's gaze flicked, seemingly idly, to the man's cuffs. A handsome pair. Onyx, Ashworth said, glancing down with an indulgent smile. A gift. They have the pleasing quality of never drawing attention, except from gentlemen with an eye for detail. Some details insist on being noticed, Pinkerton said. Did you own another pair with enamel? Green, perhaps. Good heavens, no. Green is for country ties and billiard tables. Dr. Lionel Marbury presented a stark contrast, nervous, conscientious, and stiff with self-reproach. If I had insisted on an immediate examination rather than waiting for the household to assemble, if... You did quite right, Pinkerton said shortly. Did you administer any medicine to Mr. Carstone yesterday? A draught for indigestion at 4 o'clock. Bismuth and mint. He was a man of heavy dinners. And later? Nothing. I slept badly, the wind off the sea irritates my chest. I walked the corridor for a few minutes at 1 o'clock so as not to disturb anyone. I heard a door close softly, somewhere beyond the stairs. You saw no one? No. Lady Margaret Bexley drifted in as if arriving for tea rather than questioning, her green silk wrapper rustling in gentle mockery of Mrs. Kersey's memory. I suppose I am the green phantom of the back stair, Mr. Pinkerton. Do forgive me. I keep irregular hours. Poetry does not arrange itself to suit the proprieties. Were you abroad at 12:20? She tilted her head. Shortly after. I had a turn of nerves and fancied hot milk. I went down as far as the hall and then decided I would not trouble the kitchen fire. The library door was shut. I saw no one. If Mrs. Kersey saw a shadow it was likely mine. Your candor is obliging. She smiled. Oh, I have nothing to conceal. It is a great luxury. Ada Whitcomb, last of the guests, looked smaller by daylight, her vivacity burnt down to a tight wick. The sketchbook was with her again. You draw constantly, Miss Whitcomb, Pinkerton observed. It helps me think. She opened the book without being asked and turned to the page she had made in the drawing room the previous evening, the fire screen, the line of the mantel, and, in a corner, a quick miniature of the dinner table, place settings no more than smudges. 2 small dark squares marked at the wrists of a scribbled figure labeled C.A. Mr. Ashworth. He had black cufflinks last night and the night before. He plays with them when he is bored. I notice hands. Pinkerton said nothing. The small crescent of mother-of-pearl in his pocket seemed to press more distinctly against the leather. I went to my room at 10, Ada continued, but I could not sleep. I heard a clinking at past, metal against stone, perhaps, and later, footsteps. I thought of coming down to sketch the library, it has such good lines. I did not. When the guests were done, Pinkerton called Peters, the first footman, a fair young man with the composed face of someone trying to remember whether he has done anything that might be misconstrued. You received a letter by hand last night? Yes, sir. It was pushed under the side door at 5 minutes to 8. I took it to Mr. Carstone immediately. He read it and laughed, only, begging your pardon, sir, it didn't sound like a proper laugh. You saw no mark upon it? No, sir. But it smelt a little, like sealing wax. Green sealing wax. Peters looked surprised. Yes, sir. How did you? Never mind. Did you see the library key at any time after dinner? No, sir. By late morning, Pinkerton had what he always liked best, a pattern that refused to be simple. A candle on the back stair and a remembered flash of green. A letter by hand smelling of wax. A butler who slept too well, a housekeeper who locked the master's desk, and a dead man whose sleeve was damp but whose glass was tidy. A filed sliver from a keyhole and a crescent of mother-of-pearl that did not belong to onyx. He asked Mrs. Carstone's permission and opened the writing desk in her presence. The top tray held the neat paraphernalia of business, foolscap, envelopes, a stick of green wax, a seal bearing a rampant stag. In the second tray he found a blotter whose top sheet bore, faintly, the impressed outline of a word written with heavy hand, Forg, and below it, repeated, Forg, Forg, good. He laid a blank page over the indentations and shaded it lightly with a pencil. The shapes rose like something dusted from a fossil. Someone had practiced the note before committing it. Not his writing, Eleanor Carstone said softly. Henry's hand was bolder when he was resolute and cramped only if he were cold. Pinkerton replaced the tray and closed the desk. He stood a moment looking through the window at the bare winter garden where lines and borders declared a geometry as strict as any ledger page. He could feel the threads tugging, one toward the hall hooks and their missing library key, one toward a silk wrapper seen in the half-light, one toward a gentleman whose black cufflinks were emphatically not mother-of-pearl, and one, stubborn and insistent, toward the seal with the rampant stag and the green wax tear that had blistered upon the coals. He turned back to Mrs. Carstone. I shall ask all the guests to remain here another night. There is a liar among us, and I should like to see how that person behaves when they believe their first contrivance has succeeded. You think, she said, that Henry did not take his own life. I think, said Allan Pinkerton, that someone has been at pains to make it appear so, and that they were clever enough to prepare their stage, but not quite clever enough to erase every footmark in the dust. Outside, a cloud dragged its shadow across the lawn like a curtain closing for an interval. Inside, the household resumed its subdued routine. Pinkerton set his watch, asked Hastings to order lamps for the library at dusk, and quietly arranged for Peters to leave, in plain sight, a note upon the pantry tray to say that the police from Whitby would arrive by the late train. It was not true. But he was now curious to learn who, upon reading it, would show the quick, involuntary start of a person who knows the difference between a performance and a trap. Chapter 4, The Web Tightens. The afternoon sun, when it finally showed itself, slanted across Whitby Grange in cold, clear beams, catching on frosted branches and the tall windows of the library. From his seat in the bay window, Allan Pinkerton could see the gravel sweep of the drive. The house appeared, to any passer-by, a place of calm domestic order. But inside, it was a cage, and the occupants were beginning to chafe at the bars. By his request, the guests were encouraged to keep to the public rooms, where their movements could be observed without the constraint of formal surveillance. Pinkerton understood human nature well enough to know that, under strain, people betrayed themselves more by accident than by interrogation. Lady Margaret, wrapped once more in green silk, occupied the writing desk in the drawing-room, ostensibly composing letters. Charles Ashworth read the Times with an air of exaggerated absorption, though he was turning the same page for half an hour. Miss Ada Whitcomb had stationed herself in the window alcove, sketching the chimney-piece with a focus that seemed, to Pinkerton's mind, half genuine and half self-conscious. Dr. Marbury busied himself with medical journals in the corner, but every so often glanced up with a hunted look. The air was brittle with things unsaid. Shortly after luncheon, Pinkerton took a quiet walk through the back corridors, the sort that guests seldom entered. The smell of beeswax and coal dust hung here, the latter drifting from the servants' passage. At the far end, in a little cupboard where Hastings kept household odds and ends, Pinkerton's eye fell on a small tray containing 2 unremarkable keys. Both were labeled in Hastings' neat hand, cellar and garden gate. But there was a faint square of dust beside them, and the subtle impression of where another key had once lain. Returning to the main hall, Pinkerton stopped Peters, the footman. "Has anyone asked you for a key today?" "No, sir," Peters said, but his pause was fractionally too long. Pinkerton smiled faintly. "You have a trustworthy face, Peters. That is a blessing. It means people believe you when you repeat their words exactly to me. Now, who was it?" The young man colored. "Miss Whitcomb, sir. She wanted the garden gate key. Said she fancied a walk to the lane. I told her you'd said no one was to leave the grounds." "Very proper." "And her reply?" Peters hesitated again. "She laughed, sir. Said she'd find her own way." Pinkerton thanked him and moved on, filing the remark away like a piece on a chessboard, its significance uncertain until other pieces shifted. By mid-afternoon, he had set his little stratagem in motion. The false note about the police arriving by the late train was left, in plain view, on the pantry tray. Hastings carried it to the hall table as if by habit. Pinkerton stationed himself discreetly in the doorway of the morning room, leafing through an atlas but watching, in the reflection of the glass, the approach of each guest. The first to pass was Lady Margaret. She swept by without a glance, humming under her breath. Next came Dr. Marbury, who paused only long enough to frown at the note as though the very sight of it pained him. Ashworth appeared a few minutes later, read the note carefully, and allowed the faintest smile to touch his lips before walking on. But it was Miss Whitcomb whose reaction caught Pinkerton's trained attention. She slowed, leaned in to read, and then, just for a heartbeat, gripped the edge of the table as though to steady herself. The fingers tightened, then released. She walked away briskly, but her sketchbook hung at her side instead of being clutched protectively to her chest. It was enough. Before tea, Pinkerton asked Hastings to bring him the household's guest register, a small leather-bound book in which arrivals and departures were logged. As he ran his finger down the neat columns, he saw that Miss Whitcomb's entry was in a different hand than the others, and dated 2 days before the party officially began. The name above hers, crossed out, was E. Whittaker. The ink of the crossing out was fresher than the entry itself. Interesting. He had no opportunity to pursue the matter before Ada herself appeared at the library door. "Mr. Pinkerton, might I trouble you for a word?" "Alone, if you please." He gestured her in. She remained standing, her small frame tense. "I think someone has been in my room," she said without preamble. "My portfolio was moved. I keep it under the bed when I'm not working." "Did you see who?" "No. But a sheet of paper I'd tucked inside is missing." "What was on it?" Her eyes flicked away. "A sketch. From memory. Of Mr. Carstone. And an impression of the note they said he left. I only glimpsed it when Lady Margaret, foolishly, I think, picked it up before you took charge." Pinkerton studied her. "Why sketch it?" "I have an interest in handwriting," she said quickly. "Shapes of letters. It's almost a game. I thought the note looked odd." "In what way?" "The loops were uneven. The downstrokes on the G and Y were too heavy for someone writing in haste or distress. And there was a flourish on the F that doesn't match anything I saw in Mr. Carstone's other letters. He was a friend of my father's, and I've seen his correspondence." This, Pinkerton thought, matched Eleanor Carstone's quiet assertion that the note was not in her husband's hand. But why would Miss Whitcomb admit it so freely, unless she wanted him to know she had noticed? He thanked her and assured her he would look into the matter. That evening, as the household gathered for dinner, Pinkerton allowed the conversation to drift. Ashworth dominated, telling an anecdote about a courtroom farce, Lady Margaret countering with a scandal from the Riviera, Eleanor Carstone silent but watchful. In the pause between courses, Pinkerton asked, as if idly, "Has anyone here been to Whitby village in the last week?" Ashworth's eyes flicked to Lady Margaret before he shook his head. Dr. Marbury murmured something about not leaving the grounds since his arrival. Miss Whitcomb, spoon poised, said simply, "I arrived through the village." "When?" Pinkerton asked. "Monday morning." "But the party began Wednesday," he said. She smiled faintly. "I like to sketch a place before it fills with people." "Is that suspicious?" Pinkerton did not answer. His mind was already sifting, a guest who came early, a note with a false hand, a missing cufflink fragment, and a smear of green wax. When the meal ended, he made his final round of the library. By the fire, on the small table, Hastings had placed the day's post. Among the letters was one, unstamped, addressed in a careful, blocky hand to Mrs. Eleanor Carstone. He lifted it delicately with a paper knife and noted the seal, green wax, flattened slightly, bearing the impression of a rampant stag. It seemed the past was not done with Whitby Grange. Chapter 5, The Past Casts Shadows. The morning broke pale and brittle, the frost etching every branch and windowpane in delicate white lace. Pinkerton, already at his desk in the library, reviewed the events with the care of a jeweler turning a gem under the light. Each facet, the missing key, the green wax, the forged note, caught the sun differently, hinting at a deeper flaw beneath. A knock sounded. Hastings entered with a card upon a silver salver. "The Reverend Mr. Pritchard, sir." "The vicar from Whitby." Pinkerton's brows lifted. "Show him in." The vicar was a thin man with eyes like polished pewter and hands mottled by years of cold stone churches. "Mr. Pinkerton, I trust you'll forgive the intrusion. I heard the dreadful news from the groom who came into the village. It stirred old memories." Pinkerton gestured to a chair. "Please, sit." "What sort of memories?" The vicar's gaze moved to the fire. "Nearly 8 years ago, there was an inquest, quietly handled, for the sake of several families, into the death of a young man named Stephen Ormond. He was found drowned in the tidal pools below the cliffs. There were whispers of quarrels, of a letter gone missing, of a wager turned ugly. No verdict of foul play was ever recorded. And the connection to Whitby Grange? Mr. Carstone, Lady Margaret, and Mr. Ashworth were all present at the gathering where the quarrel began. Dr. Marbury was not here then, but his elder brother was. The matter was hushed. The Ormonds were not without influence, but in a small parish, nothing is truly forgotten. Was Miss Ada Whitcomb involved? The vicar hesitated. No. But her father was Stephen Ormond's solicitor. He left the area not long after the inquest. Some said he was persuaded. Pinkerton inclined his head. And the letter you mentioned, what was in it? That, no one could say. It was rumored to contain an accusation, or perhaps an admission. But it vanished before the constable could secure it. The vicar rose, fastening his coat. Forgive me for speaking ill of the dead, but Mr. Carstone was a man to whom loyalty was conditional, and a quarrel with him seldom ended in reconciliation. I fear your tragedy here may be the echo of that older one. When the vicar had gone, Pinkerton stood for a long moment by the window, watching the frost steam away from the gravel where the morning sun touched it. He had learned something vital. The shadow over Whitby Grange was longer than the current week, and whatever was written in those anonymous threats had deep roots. By late morning, he had Eleanor Carstone in the morning room, the winter light falling full on her face. Mrs. Carstone, the Reverend Pritchard tells me your husband was present when Stephen Ormond died. Her lips tightened. I told Henry never to speak of that night again. But someone here has spoken of it, or written of it, and your husband was being threatened with exposure. Her eyes flicked briefly towards the door. It was a wretched business. A foolish wager on whether Ormond would climb down to the pools by moonlight. He'd been drinking. Henry claimed it was an accident. But Stephen had argued violently with Charles Ashworth earlier in the evening. And Lady Margaret, well, she could be cruel when she was bored. You believe one of them pushed him? I believe, nothing I can prove. And proof is all that matters, isn't it, Mr. Pinkerton? Indeed, he said softly. When she had gone, Pinkerton asked Hastings to find Lady Margaret. She arrived in a waft of perfume, her green silk gown rustling as always. I am told you knew Stephen Ormond, Pinkerton began. I knew him well enough to know he was reckless and vain. And dead men make such convenient saints, don't they? You were there when he fell. Her eyes met his, amused and dangerous. Do you suppose I lured him to the cliffs? Or perhaps struck him with a candlestick in the billiard room? I suppose, Pinkerton said mildly, that you have a taste for drama. Lady Margaret laughed, low and unhurried. If someone is trying to rake up that old scandal, they have less imagination than I credited them with. And if they think Henry Carstone's death will be believed as suicide, they are even more foolish. Why do you say that? Because Henry was vain enough to fight death the way he fought his business rivals, tooth and claw. He would have left a note longer than 3 words, and it would have been in perfect copperplate. Pinkerton let her go, noting her untroubled gait. Whether her confidence came from innocence or arrogance remained to be seen. That afternoon, he walked into Whitby village under the pretense of sending a telegram, and paid a discreet visit to the solicitor's office. The current partner, an elderly man with watery eyes, recalled James Whitcomb, Ada's father, well enough. He left under a cloud, you know, the solicitor said. After Ormond's death. Took a position in Leeds. Rumor had it he knew more than was good for him, and someone saw to it that his reputation here was diminished. Pinkerton returned to the Grange as the light was fading. In the library, he took the forged note from its envelope and studied it again under the lamp. The loops and strokes Ada had described were indeed inconsistent. He tried the rampant stag seal from Carstone's desk on a scrap of paper. The impression was perfect, too perfect. The one on the anonymous letter to Mrs. Carstone had been slightly blurred, as though pressed by a hand unfamiliar with the motion. By dinner, the mood in the household had soured further. The guests spoke in fragments. Dr. Marbury pushed his food about his plate, Ashworth's wit had taken on a sharper edge. Ada, pale but resolute, kept her eyes down, sketching between courses. Pinkerton knew the next move would have to be his. The web had tightened, but the fly was not yet aware that the spider was watching. Chapter 6, The Trap is Set. The following morning brought a pale, steady rain that blurred the view beyond Whitby Grange's tall windows. It was the sort of weather that pressed people indoors and frayed tempers with its dull insistence. Pinkerton, however, welcomed it. Bad weather was an ally. It made suspects restless, more likely to reveal themselves through impatience or misplaced confidence. After breakfast, he quietly asked Hastings to see that the library remained unlocked all day and that the fire was kept burning. "And tell the household," Pinkerton added, "that I will be examining Mr. Carstone's papers there for the remainder of the morning. Make certain that remark is overheard." Hastings, well versed in the art of discreet theatre, inclined his head. "Very good, sir." By 9:30, Pinkerton was seated at the large oak desk with an assortment of papers, most of them blank. He arranged them in neat stacks, took out the forged note, and set it squarely in the center. Every so often, he rose to consult the shelves or stand at the window, his movements casual, unhurried, as if he were a man with all the time in the world. The household's rhythms drifted in from beyond the half-open door, the clink of teacups in the morning room, a burst of Lady Margaret's laugh in the drawing room, the faint tread of footsteps along the hall. Twice, Pinkerton caught a shadow moving just out of sight near the library door. At 10 o'clock, he left deliberately, instructing Hastings in a voice that carried, "No one is to touch these papers in my absence." Then he walked out into the rain, hat brim low, and crossed to the stone folly at the edge of the garden, a place from which, through a discreet gap in the curtains, he could watch the library door without being seen. It took less than 15 minutes. Miss Ada Whitcomb appeared first. She paused on the threshold, glanced up and down the corridor, and slipped inside. She was gone again within 2 minutes, her sketchbook now clutched to her chest. Pinkerton noted the way she hugged it close, as though concealing something newly acquired. An hour later, Charles Ashworth entered. His approach was different, confident, almost leisurely. He remained in the library longer, perhaps 5 minutes, before leaving with a small smile playing at his mouth. Pinkerton could not see whether he carried anything. By noon, the fire had burned low. Pinkerton returned, damp from the garden. The forged note was gone from the desk. In its place was a folded sheet of fresh foolscap, blank on one side, but on the reverse a message in firm block capitals, "Stop digging or you will join him." It was a clumsy threat, lacking the elegance of the earlier anonymous letters, the work of someone under strain. After luncheon, Pinkerton made his second move. He summoned the household to the drawing room under the pretext of giving an update. Standing by the mantel, he let his gaze move deliberately from face to face. "I have sent a detailed account of our situation to the local constabulary," he said, his voice level. "They will arrive tomorrow to take formal statements. In the meantime, I will be conducting a demonstration in the library this evening at 9 o'clock. I believe it will clarify certain points." No one spoke, but he caught the ripple of unease that passed among them. Eleanor Carstone's hands tightened in her lap, Lady Margaret's brow arched, Dr. Marbury's lips pressed together. Ada Whitcomb kept her head down, shading something in her book. Ashworth, however, met Pinkerton's gaze with cool amusement. "A demonstration, Mr. Pinkerton. You make it sound like a conjurer's trick." "Perhaps it is," Pinkerton replied mildly. The hours until 9 seemed to stretch like the drawn-out beats of a clock in an empty room. Pinkerton spent them quietly in his chamber, arranging the props for his trap. At 8:30, he slipped down to the library and dimmed the gas lamps until the room was bathed in a soft, flickering light. He positioned the high-backed armchair precisely where Carstone's had been found, the desk cleared save for a single letter sealed with green wax. By the time the household gathered, the fire was glowing low, the shadows deepening. Pinkerton gestured for them to stand in a half-circle. "You will forgive the theatricality," he said, "but I have always found that a reconstruction sharpens the memory." He indicated the armchair. "This is where Mr. Carstone sat on the night he died. This," he held up the sealed letter, "is a replica of the note he was reading when the fatal moment approached. I have, of course, taken precautions." The group shifted uneasily. Ada's gaze fixed on the seal, Ashworth's eyes narrowed, Lady Margaret's lips curled in faint amusement. "I will ask each of you, in turn, to step forward and take this letter to the desk, as though you meant to open it." The first two complied with apparent indifference, Lady Margaret with languid grace, Dr. Marbury with brisk awkwardness. Ada took the letter lightly, as though it might burn her fingers. Ashworth, last, held it for a fraction longer than necessary before handing it back. When it was done, Pinkerton placed the letter back on the desk and turned the key in the library door. "Thank you. That will be all for now. I suggest you all retire, tomorrow will be a long day." They dispersed, some curious, others wary. Pinkerton, remaining behind, crossed swiftly to the desk. The green wax seal bore a new mark, the faintest smudge, almost invisible, at the lower edge. He took a magnifying lens from his pocket. Yes, a minute crescent of nacre, matching the fragment he carried, had lodged there. It was the proof he needed. Now the only question was whether the murderer would make their final, desperate move before morning, and whether Pinkerton could be ready to catch them in the act. Chapter 7, The Final Gathering. Rain lashed the windows through the night, rattling in the casements and drumming on the slate roof. It was the sort of weather that magnified unease, turning shadows into watchers and creaks into whispers. Allan Pinkerton slept little. He was up before dawn, reviewing his notes by the muted glow of the lamp, listening to the house stir into life with the first faint sounds of servants on the stairs. By mid-morning, the strain in the household was almost visible. Lady Margaret spent her time in the morning room, idly dealing a deck of playing cards, her green silk gown a shimmer of defiance against the grey day. Dr. Marbury paced the hall, pausing only to stare into the rain. Ada Whitcomb had retreated to a window seat, sketchbook open but untouched, the pencil motionless in her hand. Charles Ashworth appeared outwardly calm, but there was a new tautness to the line of his jaw, as if he were holding himself in check. Eleanor Carstone moved quietly among them all, speaking little, her eyes shadowed. If she noticed the tension, she did not show it. At 11 o'clock, Pinkerton summoned Hastings. "Kindly inform the guests that I wish to see them in the library at 2 o'clock sharp," he said. "Make it clear this is not a request." Hastings, with a faint gleam in his eye, bowed. "Very good, sir." The announcement had its intended effect. Pinkerton saw the subtle reactions ripple through the group. Lady Margaret raised a single eyebrow and gave a low laugh, as though daring him to surprise her. Dr. Marbury stiffened and immediately left the hall. Ada's head jerked up, her eyes darting briefly toward Ashworth before returning to her sketchbook. And Ashworth himself? He smiled, the sort of smile a man uses to mask calculation. The hours leading to 2 o'clock crept forward. Pinkerton used the time to prepare the library. The fire was built high, casting long shadows across the polished floor. On the desk, beside the lamp, he placed 3 objects, the forged note, the crescent of mother of pearl, and the green wax-sealed letter. They looked almost innocent, but each was a thread in the noose. When the guests entered, Pinkerton was standing by the hearth, one hand resting lightly on the mantel. The butler closed the door behind them with deliberate finality. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pinkerton began, his voice calm but carrying clearly, "we are all gathered here because a man is dead, Henry Carstone, your host. His death was made to look like suicide. It was not. It was murder." No one spoke, but Pinkerton saw the ripple of unease, shoulders tensing, eyes narrowing, fingers tightening around chair arms. "I have not called the police yet," he went on, "because I believe the truth could be found here, within these walls, and without giving the guilty party an early chance to flee. That belief has been justified." He moved to the desk, touching the forged note. This was placed in Mr. Carstone's hand to give the appearance of despair. "But it is a forgery, a poor one. The loops, the downstrokes, the flourishes, all wrong for the man's usual hand." Mrs. Carstone and Miss Whitcomb both confirmed this. Ada shifted in her seat. Ashworth's gaze remained fixed on the fire. Pinkerton picked up the small crescent of mother of pearl. This was found near Mr. Carstone's chair on the night of the murder. It is part of a cufflink, broken, perhaps, in the moment of the act. His eyes moved to Ashworth, whose cuffs today were fastened with plain silver links. "And then we have the seal." He held up the green wax-sealed letter. The anonymous threats to Mr. Carstone bore this same crest, a rampant stag, yet the seal was pressed clumsily, unlike the precise impressions Mr. Carstone himself would make. Whoever used it was unfamiliar with the tool. Lady Margaret spoke at last, her voice low but sharp. "All this proves is that someone in the house forged a note and sealed a letter. It does not prove who." Pinkerton inclined his head. "Quite so. Which is why I set a trap." He let the words hang, watching their effect. Dr. Marbury's brow furrowed, Ada's hands tightened on her skirt, Ashworth's smile thinned to a line. "Yesterday," Pinkerton continued, "I left the forged note in the library while pretending to be absent. 2 people entered. One removed the note and left a threat in its place. When I repeated the exercise with a sealed letter, only one person handled it in such a way as to leave a fragment of mother of pearl on the wax." He turned to the group, his voice softening. "The guilty party is here, among us. And before this afternoon is over, they will have no choice but to confess." Ashworth's gaze met his, steady, unreadable. Lady Margaret leaned back, folding her arms. Ada's eyes darted again toward Ashworth, but quickly away. Pinkerton stepped back to the hearth. "I will give the person responsible one last chance to speak before I name them. In the next hour, I will be in this room. The door will remain open. I will see who chooses silence, and who chooses to end it." With that, he dismissed them. The guests filed out, each carrying their own measure of tension. Pinkerton watched them go, noting every twitch, every flicker of the eyes. The trap was set, the net was drawn tight, and all that remained was for the killer to make their fatal move. Chapter 8, The Truth Revealed. The rain eased by mid-afternoon, leaving the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and smoke from the library fire. Pinkerton sat at the desk, the green wax-sealed letter before him, waiting. Hastings had orders to admit anyone who wished to speak to him privately. The house was unnervingly quiet, save for the occasional creak of timber or soft fall of footsteps in the hall. At 20 minutes past 3, the door opened. Ada Whitcomb stepped inside, sketchbook in hand. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "Mr. Pinkerton," she said quietly, "I know who killed Mr. Carstone. But I don't think you'll believe me unless you see this." She placed the sketchbook on the desk, open to a page filled with quick, bold lines. It showed the library as it had been on the night of the murder, Carstone in the armchair, another figure leaning over him, one hand holding a glass, the other reaching into his coat pocket. The face was indistinct, but the outline of the sleeve and cufflink was unmistakable. "It's Mr. Ashworth," she said. Pinkerton studied the drawing. "You saw this?" "No. But I heard the voices, I was outside the door. I recognized his tone." Pinkerton closed the book gently. "Thank you, Miss Whitcomb. That will be all for now." She hesitated, then left. Pinkerton knew what this was, not a confession, but a prod. Either she truly believed Ashworth guilty, or she wanted him to believe it. In either case, the time had come. At 4 o'clock, he rang the bell for Hastings. "Gather everyone in the library, if you please." Within minutes, the household assembled, Lady Margaret with her cool amusement, Dr. Marbury looking drawn and wary, Ada with her sketchbook clutched like a talisman, Eleanor Carstone composed but tense, and Charles Ashworth standing with his hands lightly in his pockets. Pinkerton remained by the hearth, the firelight catching the lines of his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "when I arrived here, I was told Mr. Carstone had taken his own life. A locked room, a note, and a glass of liquor seemed to support that view. But the details were wrong, deliberately wrong. Someone wanted us to believe in suicide. The truth was far more deliberate." He held up the forged note. "This was not written by Mr. Carstone. The handwriting was imitated, but poorly, the flourishes too deliberate, the pressure inconsistent. Mrs. Carstone and Miss Whitcomb confirmed the mismatch." He placed the crescent of mother of pearl beside it. "This fragment was found near the body. It came from a cufflink. The break was fresh, the edges sharp. Only one person here owns such links." His eyes went to Ashworth. The barrister's mouth twitched into a smile. "And you think that proves me guilty?" "It would, if the cufflink were yours," Pinkerton replied calmly. "But it was not. It belonged to someone else, someone who no longer wears them because one is broken." He turned to Lady Margaret. "You had a pair, did you not? A gift from your late husband?" Her brows rose. "I did. One went missing last year." "No," Pinkerton said, "it broke the night Mr. Carstone died. You were in the library with him, not Ashworth. Mrs. Kersey saw your green silk wrapper on the back stairs. The sealing wax found in the grate matched the wax in Mr. Carstone's desk, wax you had no legitimate reason to use." Lady Margaret laughed lightly. "You think I killed him over some ancient quarrel?" "I think," Pinkerton said, "that Stephen Ormond's death 8 years ago was no accident. You and Mr. Carstone shared that secret. You feared the recent threats meant he might turn on you to save himself." He lifted the green wax-sealed letter. "You forged this and the suicide note, knowing the police would suspect no further danger. But your plan was careless in 2 ways. First, you locked the library door from outside with a filed key, thinking no one would notice the tiny scrap of metal in the escutcheon. Second, when you handled this letter during my test last night, the jagged edge of your broken cufflink left a sliver of nacre in the wax." For the first time, Lady Margaret's composure faltered. "This is absurd." "No," Pinkerton said evenly. It is murder. You brought the glass of poisoned brandy to Mr. Carstone under the pretense of making peace. You stood close enough to slip the forged note into his pocket as he drank. The damp on his sleeve came from the drink you spilled when you steadied him, and the fragment of cufflink fell then, unnoticed. Silence pressed against the walls. Eleanor Carstone's hand tightened on the back of her chair. Dr. Marbury stared at Lady Margaret in open disbelief. Pinkerton's tone softened, but the precision remained. When Stephen Ormond died, you were the one who dared him to climb the cliffs. You feared he might tell the truth about your quarrel with him, and Henry Carstone covered for you. You repaid that debt with poison when you thought he might betray you in turn. Lady Margaret's gaze moved from face to face, measuring her chances. Then she gave a small, brittle smile. Well, Mr. Pinkerton, I see why they call you the man who never fails. What happens now? I will escort you to the Whitby Constabulary myself, Pinkerton said. I suggest you make your statement while the facts are still fresh. She gave a low laugh, almost admiring, and allowed Hastings to lead her away. When the door closed, Eleanor Carstone spoke quietly. You've brought the truth, Mr. Pinkerton. That is something. Truth, Pinkerton said, is like the tide. You can push it back for a time, but it always returns.